Hey, 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 post tenebras lux, after darkness light. I do hope that you are all caught up on the last episode in this Old Testament Witness to the Trinity series, because this episode is going to build off of that one. And so just as a brief recap, last time I pointed you to several texts where God is referred to in the plural. For example, I mentioned Ecclesiastes 12:1, where the Hebrew literally says, "Remember also your creators," plural, "in the days of your youth." Now, that's not translated in the plural into English. In most versions, you will find it in something like Young's literal translation, but it is plural in the Hebrew. And the Hebrew text, of course, trumps all. The Hebrew text is the inspired text. As well in Psalm 149, verse 2, it says, "Let Israel be glad in his makers." Again, that's found in the Hebrew text. I don't know of any English version that renders it that way. I'm not even sure if it appears in Young's literal translation that way. But in any case, again, it's in the inspired, God-breathed Hebrew text of Psalm 149 too. I also pointed out Isaiah 54:5, where God is referred to as your husbands, your makers. So you actually have two plurals in that verse. In fact, it says your husbands is your makers, whose name is the Lord of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. So it makes reference to the Lord of hosts and your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, in a text where God is referred to in the plural. So I mentioned many passages along those lines. Those are just three of the several that I mentioned last time. Now, the reason those are of particular relevance, and I'm hoping that you're remembering them, and for that reason have also reminded you, is because the text that I want to look at today are those plural texts that are found in the book of Genesis, where God speaks as us and our, especially the lead text, Genesis 1:26, where God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness." And then the verse goes on to say, so God created man. You'll note there that in Genesis 1, it uses both the word for make and the word for create. In verse 26, it says, "Let us make man." And in verse 27, it says, "So God created man." So there you have the word for make and create. Now here, they're not in the plural, but you do have God speaking in the plural. Okay, so this is not a one-off. This is the sort of thing that you find over and over again in the Hebrew text, that God is spoken of as creator in the context of creation in the plural number. Okay, so I hope everybody is on board with that. Yes, good reminder. I saw the light. Hit that like button. I don't often remind people to hit the like button. I always hope it just kind of goes without saying. If you like it, then like it, right? And if you're a Christian, then the Lord will be pleased with your like. If you're a Muslim, don't like it, Allah will not be pleased. And if you're a Satanist or an atheist, don't like it, because, well, if you're an atheist, there's no one to care. So I don't know, maybe you can like it. But in any case, hit the like button and tell your friends about these studies. I do hope they're a blessing to all of you. I hope they're edifying. I do spend a good bit of time preparing for these episodes, not as far as the background study. All of that, as far as this issue, is stuff that I've done for decades. But preparing slides, thinking through the order in which I'm going to present things. If I have any kind of OCD hangups, it's always on the issue of the proper order in which to present things. I usually sit around mulling for hours, thinking, should I mention this first? Should I mention that first? And I'm usually thinking of what will bring about maximum clarity, maximum impact. And so I do spend a lot of time prepping. And by the way, thanks to those of you who support, I was able to get this new arm for a mic setup, and I've also been, working on acquiring some other things to make these broadcasts better and more enjoyable for you. And I hope that does make it better for all of you. All right, so I hope all of you are doing well. Oh yeah, and thanks for reminding me again, Riaz, that I'm on Patreon. If you want to support this, if you are blessed, then feel free to support. If not, I'm happy to be a blessing to you in any case. We serve the Lord, and our reward is ultimately with Him. Let's look at the Old Testament. Let's look at the Old Testament. And Talitha Kumi says it's all Greek to me. That's okay. Well, hopefully it's all Hebrew to you here in just a minute, because we're going to be looking at the Old Testament now. So again, remember, I pointed to several passages where God is spoken of in the plural as our creators and our makers. Okay, that is already significant when we look at a text like Genesis 1:26. In Genesis 1:26, just to pull the passage up, you have the well-known text where it says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." Okay, now that first word in Hebrew, let us make, is na'asa, and it's a first-person common plural form of the verb asa, which means to do or to make. And as a plural, then it literally means let us make. Okay, the same thing is true when it comes to the noun betzelmenu, which is a first-person common plural form of the verb selam, and that word means image, right? The word selam means image, and it's preceded by what is known as a bet preposition, right? Whenever you have a bet at the beginning of a word that doesn't, when you have a bet before a word like this, bet selam, it is the preposition meaning in. So for example, when Genesis 1:1 begins, Bereshit bara Elohim, right? Bereshit is, you have the bet preposition. That's where you get the word in, joined with the word rosh, which is the word for beginning, right? Like Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah means the head of the year, the new year. And so Bereshit means in the beginning. So when God says here, in our image, it's a plural form of that with the bet preposition preceding it, and it literally means in our image. So here is a special instance of plurals, at least in the sense that it does carry over into the English text. Just why English translators do not render other examples of divine plurals into the English text is a matter of a whole different discussion. But again, remember, the Hebrew text is what's inspired. The Hebrew text is what was God breathed. And so whether or not the translators render it that way is quite aside from insignificant as far as the question of the truth goes. But the text here in Genesis 1:26 not only says in our image, or let us make man in our image, but also according to, oops, wrong slide, according to our likeness, which is kidmutenu, right? A singular form of demut, which means likeness. And here again, you have a preposition preceding it, joined to the word. It's a word that means according to. So that's where you get the according to in the verse. It also has the embedded personal subject nu at the end, which is plural, meaning our. So it literally means according to our likeness. Now, if you've been around at all for any bit of time, you know that there are a couple of famous canards that people will raise here in an attempt to circumvent the divine import, the Trinitarian import of this plural language. This one is popular among Unitarians as well as Islamic or Muslim Unitarians. And I'll say something about Muslims here in a moment if I recall or if I remember. But you're familiar with the fact that people will often say this is just a royal we or a plural of majesty, such as Queen Victoria, who quipped, "We are not amused." So many people will say that's all that's going on here. God, of course, is the majesty of all majesties. So if an earthly potentate speaks in the plural when that person really isn't a plurality of subjects, then all the more can God speak in the plural number. Now, let me just take a step back here before even looking at the grammar and point out a devastating incongruity here. Now, I actually pointed this out to David Wood a long time ago, and he went and made a video on it. If I had recalled, I would have, maybe I'll put it in the description box at the end. But one of the things I pointed out is if you take a step back and think through the implications of Unitarianism, well, then it should be obvious to you that if God is absolutely one, right, and there is no plurality in him in any sense, right? In other words, he's not just the only being who is God to the exclusion of other beings, but within himself, there is no diversity of persons. Well, then it's a strange idea to think that the best way to bespeak majesty is by using the plural number. Okay, I quite grant that the notion of plurality betokens fullness, majesty, glory, and so forth. But then that seems to presuppose that for somebody to be truly majestic, then he couldn't be exclusively one, not in the sense that Unitarians are talking about, right? He would have to have some kind of fullness in his being that corresponded to this language. Otherwise, it makes no sense for such a being to employ this language in order to, indicate his majesty. So I just find linguistically, philosophically, the whole notion of a plural of majesty being used for a being who is absolutely one, right? Not a plurality of persons. I find the whole notion to be incongruous. I don't think that's consistent in any stretch of the imagination. If Allah is absolutely one and he is majestic, then it should be singular terms that would speak of majesty, right? And it should be singular terms that bespeak majesty in the case of any Unitarian conception of God, not just the Islamic conception. But in any case, this canard is very popular. And the fact of the matter is it has no basis in the Hebrew text, especially when it comes to verbs. Okay, remember, I already pointed out that the word "let us make," which is in the plural, is a verb. And in Hebrew, there's no such thing as a plural of majesty with respect to verbs. Okay, and this is pointed out by a whole host of scholars. I'm not now talking about other terms that might be in the plural. We could talk about those other terms. We could talk about plural nouns like Elohim or Adonim or Adonai. We could talk about other plural terms like that and whether or not one could use something like a plural of majesty to account for that. But when it comes to verbs, Hebrew scholars are agreed across the board there is no such thing as a plural of majesty in Hebrew. Here's a handful of scholars that point that out to you. Here is Klaus Westermann in his commentary on Genesis, and he says, the plural of majesty does not occur in Hebrew. He's referring to 126. So this older explanation has been completely abandoned today. Notice he says completely abandoned. There is no scholar on the planet, according to Klaus Westermann, who would say, with respect to the plural employed in Genesis 1:26, let us make, that is a plural of majesty. that notion has been completely abandoned. It had its day. It was popular. It was making the rounds, but scholarship has completely debunked it. Here's another scholar. This is from Gerhard Hazel. This comes from an article in the Andrews University Seminary Studies. He says, there are no certain examples of plurals of majesty with either verbs or pronouns. The verb used in Genesis 1:26, asa, that's the verb. I pointed out it's plural in form in 1:26. He says, is never used with a plural of majesty. There is no linguistic or grammatical basis upon which the us can be considered to be a plural of majesty. No linguistic basis, right? So it's been completely abandoned today. There is no linguistic basis for saying that plural verbs are to be explained or can be explained in terms of the royal we, the plural of majesty. Here's another scholar, Taylor Lewis. You'll recall him. I quoted him before on Genesis 4:1 in my last episode. But he says, and this is in his commentary. Actually, it's interesting. This is in the commentary of John Peter Lang, which is kind of a 2-for-1. The upper portion of the commentary is Lang's commentary, but then beneath it you have Taylor Lewis's commentary. And I mention that because just the other day I was reading a scholar who attributed something to John Lang that was actually stated by Taylor Lewis. Apparently the person didn't read the introduction to the commentary where it explains the upper part above the line is the commentary by Lang, the lower portion is by Lewis. In any case, Taylor Lewis says, of all these views, that is the multiplicity of views that people have come up with, of all these views, the pluralis majestaticus, that is plural of majesty, has the least support. It is foreign to the usus loquendi of the earliest language. It is degrading instead of honoring to deity. And by the way, he doesn't spell out what he means here, but this is where I first got the idea that it's philosophically incongruous to say that God speaks in the plural in order to indicate his majesty. If Allah or God is absolutely one, well then singular terms should bespeak his majesty, not plural terms, right? But Lewis doesn't spell it out. But I started thinking through what Lewis was talking about, and this notion occurred to me. So I think that's a good guess at what he was talking about. But in any case, I think it's true. I think that's a legitimate observation on my part. But he goes on to say that Ibn Ezra, who was a famous Jewish scholar from the medieval period, he says Ibn Ezra shows that the few seeming examples brought from the Hebrew scriptures, such as Numbers 12:6, Daniel 2:36, do not bear it out. The latter, moreover, being an Aramaic mode of speech, right? So in other words, neither one of these passages are actually properly understood as plurals of majesty. And moreover, the latter passage is not even Hebrew, it's Aramaic. So it's not really relevant to the earlier Hebrew employed by Moses. But he goes on to say, if we depart at all from the patristic understanding of an allusion to a plurality of ideas in the deity, meaning the Trinity, the next best is that of Maimonides. Now, I won't go into the interpretation of Maimonides. Almost nobody holds that today. But what Lewis is saying is, it's not a plural of majesty. The best interpretation is the patristic interpretation. And if you don't know the patristic interpretation, the fact is that the early Christians from day one unanimously interpreted this as a reference to the persons of the Trinity. I have in an article on Answering Islam upwards of 20 different fathers, and I think 30 different quotes from those fathers showing this is how the fathers interpreted it. It was unanimous. There was not a single father who interpreted this differently. Now that, of course, doesn't ground the basis for which we ought to believe it is a reference to the Trinity, but the same grounds they had and the same clarity of sight that they had is also available to us, right? We are not lone rangers in this. We do build on the insights of those who came before us, and the fathers were recognizing the truth. And I'm going to spell it out further, but part of the way of spelling that out is to show that these alternative explanations, for all of their once popular appeal, are not at all viable. The plural of majesty has no credibility in the Hebrew language, right? It is thoroughly rejected by scholars. So I quoted Taylor Lewis, right? Here's Emil Radiger. Okay, Emil Radiger is the guy who updated Gesenius's lexicon. Gesenius was the father of all Hebrew lexicons. His is perhaps the best known lexicon. Emil Radiger was the one who updated it, and in an updated portion of that, which is often quoted and attributed to Gesenius, but more accurately was contributed by Radiger, he says Jewish grammarians call such plurals plural virium or virtutum. Later grammarians call them plural excellentiae, magnitudinous, or pluralis majestaticus. This last may have been suggested by the we used by kings when speaking of themselves, and he gives some late examples of that are suggested by people. But then he goes on, and the plural used by God in Genesis 1:26 and 11:7, Isaiah 6:8, has been incorrectly explained in this way. The use of the plural as a form of respectful address is quite foreign to Hebrew. Okay, so again, scholarship is unanimous here. But now let me show you something that isn't often done by people. I want to show you how this phrase is used throughout the Old Testament. Okay, here's how this phrase is used. This is Exodus 19:8. Now, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I put some of this down in writing, but I think what I have here, and I'm going to show you, is every single occurrence of this phrase in the Torah. Okay, so this is Exodus 19:8. Notice what it says. All the people answered together. Notice it says together, so it's talking about a plurality of people. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Right? That's the verb asa, to do or to make. Here, a plurality of people say, we will do. That's the same phrase that God employs in Genesis 1:26. It's in the cohortative there, right? Meaning God says, let us make there. It's cohortative. But here, they're using the same expression to say they will do what God has enjoined upon them. So obviously, this is not a plural of majesty here in Exodus 19:8. Here again, Exodus 24:3. Then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do. Na'asa, right? So again, the same phrase, the same word is used, and it's referring to a plurality of people. It's not a plural of majesty. Here again, Exodus 24:7. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Na'aseh, and we will be obedient. Okay, again, the same expression, a plurality of subjects, not a plural of majesty. Numbers 32:31, the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben answered, note sons in the plural, twice over, the sons of Gad, the sons of Reuben, saying, as the Lord has said to your servants in the plural, so we will do. I hope you're starting to see the pattern here. Okay, this expression is used repeatedly in the plural. It very clearly refers to a plurality of personal subjects. And by the way, I'm going to point out something here that's going to be relevant later, but I want you to hear it now so that we don't have to go back to these passages, or at least so that you'll know what I'm referring back to. Notice that what the people are saying here in the plural is something that all of them are going to do. Okay, they're not just saying that all of them are going to do it by means of one person. Okay, they're not saying one person is going to do this and all of us are just going to be spectators. Okay, I'll come back to that. You're going to see why this is relevant. And hopefully, even before I refer to this, you'll know why as I go along here and I bring up the next objection, the next attempt to deal with these plurals in Genesis. I hope you already think back to this and make the connection. Okay, I'll make it in any case, but notice, okay, I already showed you that. What about, notice as well, Genesis 3:22, okay? In Genesis 3:22, it says, "Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil," right? Knowing good and evil. Now, here, the reason this has a special relevance is because even if it were the case that there is such a thing as a plural of majesty in Hebrew, and I've shown that there isn't, right? Not only does that not occur in Hebrew, according to scholars, not only is that specific expression never used that way, according to all the uses in the Torah, but even if it were the case that there is such a thing as a plural of majesty, such that a person could try and give arguments that we should understand Genesis 1:26 in that way. And by the way, normally people don't give any arguments for that. They just say it's the plural of majesty. Well, even if there were a plural of majesty, that wouldn't mean that's how we're to understand Genesis 1:26. It would just mean that's an option. But then you still have to give positive arguments for understanding it in that way. But my point here is, if there were such a thing as a plural of majesty, that can't be what's going on in Genesis 3:22, because in Genesis 3:22, it doesn't say man has become like us. It says man has become like one of us. It's partitive in the Hebrew. It's talking about a plurality of which the speaker is one of that plurality, right? Man has become like one of us, right? And remember, I already pointed out elsewhere in the Old Testament, God speaks or is spoken of as creators and makers in the plural. So, there's no reticence on the part of biblical authors to use this kind of language. You'd expect if they were Unitarians, they'd avoid this. Certainly, you can be sure that every Unitarian stumbles over these verses and thinks, I wish God didn't put these verses here. Why are these verses here? In fact, I can tell you of a certainty that these verses irk Unitarians, and those are the questions that come in their mind, because you even have an ancient Jewish tradition where they put certain words into the mouth of Moses, right? Into the mouth of Moses, the Jews put this dialogue with God, where Moses says, when he gets to the part when he's writing Genesis 1:26, he says, "Master of the universe, why do you give an excuse here to the heretics, the Menim, and say, let us make?" And then God says to Moses, "You write, and whoever wants to err, let him err," right? So Jews are expressing through the mouth of Moses their own, disquiet over this. They're saying, why is this here? This gives some excuse to the heretics, right? But then they put this makeshift excuse into the mouth of Moses. All right, so Genesis 3:22 is another problematic verse for this. Okay, I already showed you those verses. There's Genesis 3:22. Now notice as well that this is really a plural. I put this up more for your later use. Maybe you're going to want to go back and look at this, the breakdown. But it's a word that means like one of us. It has the preposition kaf, the same preposition that was found before when it says, let us make man in or according to our, or in our likeness, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, right? So you have the kaf, the according to or like, at the beginning of the word. Then you have the word echad for one, and then you have the preposition mimenu, which means from or of us, right? So it literally means like one of us. But notice this, okay? Moving along, right? In Genesis 11, 1 through 4, I'm not going to read this. I think I have a slide here to go back to this, but the context is the tower builders. They're banding together. They're opposing God's command to increase and multiply, spread out, right, and subdue the earth. Instead, they're huddling together. They're trying to make a name for themselves rather than glorify God and all the earth. And because of that, God comes down in judgment. And we read about that starting in verse, I'll just read verse 7. God says, "Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they will not be able to understand one another's speech." Now, this is, I bring this up for obvious reasons. It's another example of a plural. But notice this. In the context, the tower builders themselves use plurality language, right? In Genesis 11:3, they say, "Come, let us make bricks," right? In Genesis 11:4, they say, "Come, let us build." So when God responds to this by saying, "Come, let us go down," right? It's very clear that he's responding to the words of the tower builders. And just like the tower builders, it's not one person speaking in the plural saying, "Let me make bricks, let me build a tower." It's really, truly several persons, a whole group of people, all the nations at that time. Really, they're not separate nations. So all the peoples that would form the eventually scattered nations are here all together, speaking together, saying, "Let us make bricks, let us build a tower." So God responds, "Let us go down." If this is a plural of majesty, then consistency would require that the former examples of the people saying "let us" would also be plurals of majesty, but alas, they aren't. But by the way, the same expression is used several times in Genesis, as well as other places in the Old Testament, the Tanakh. In Genesis 43:4, it says, "If you send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food." It's the same Hebrew expression. 1 Samuel 14:36, "Then Saul said, 'Let us go down after the Philistines by night and take spoil among them until the morning,'" right? So over and over again, this expression is always used to communicate a plurality of persons. Isaiah 6:8, another example of God speaking in the plural. God said, this is the context of Isaiah's call. He said, "Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?' Then I said, 'Here am I, send me.'" Now I have two other slides here real quick, and then I'm going to turn to the second objection. I think I've thoroughly beat this one to death, but I think these are about Isaiah 6:8. I could be wrong. I'm actually going to be as surprised as you are, because I forgot what these two slides are. Oh yeah, I wanted to show you what it says in the pre-Christian Jewish Targums. This is the Jerusalem Targum, and here it says, "The word of the Lord created man in his likeness. In the likeness of the presence of the Lord he created him. The male and his yoke fellow, he created them." And then again in the fragmentary Targum, it says, "The word of the Lord said, 'Let us create the Son of Man in an image like us, and let them have dominion over all creatures.' And the word of the Lord created Adam in his own image, in the image from before the Lord he created him." So here you have an ancient Jewish understanding of these plurals, that it involves, at the very least, God's word as a personal subject speaking to and about other persons. So the word is one of the persons who is involved in this plurality language. And notice very clearly the word is being distinguished from someone else being referred to as Lord. He creates him in the likeness of himself, as well as in the likeness of the presence of the Lord. So the Jewish Targumim were already reflecting on these plurality terms in the Old Testament, and seeing it in a way that would ultimately find its great expression in the Word made flesh, the Lord Jesus, and the teaching of his apostles. All right. God bless you all. Have a good evening.